I stayed in a life that looked perfect until I couldn't recognize myself anymore. If you saw my life from the outside, you'd probably think I had it figured out. That's what most people thought, and I don't blame them. Everything looked right. The job was stable. The house was clean, organized, exactly the kind of place people compliment when they walk in. The routine was consistent. Wake up early, work hard, handle responsibilities, keep things moving. There was structure, order, no chaos. And where I come from, that matters. Growing up, I learned real quick that stability isn't something you take for granted. You build it, you protect it. You don't mess it up chasing feelings or ideas that don't put food on the table. So when I finally built a life that looked solid, I held on to it tightly, because to me, that was success. Not loud success, not flashy, but real. Something that lasts, something you can rely on. And for a long time, I believed that. I believed I was doing everything right. I wasn't reckless. I wasn't lost. I wasn't struggling. I was steady. And in my mind, that was enough. Maybe more than enough. But here's the part nobody talks about. You can build a life that looks perfect on the outside and still feel like something inside you is off. Not broken, just off. At first, it's subtle, easy to ignore, just a feeling, a quiet thought that shows up every now and then. Usually late at night, when everything is quiet, when there's nothing left to distract you. And for me, the thought was simple. This doesn't feel like me. I didn't say it out loud, didn't even fully admit it to myself. I just felt it. And then I pushed it away. Because it didn't make sense. What do you mean, it doesn't feel like you? You built this. You worked for this. This is what you wanted, so I ignored it. Just like I ignored a lot of things back then. Because ignoring something is easier than questioning everything. And questioning everything? That's dangerous. At least that's how it felt. Because if I started asking real questions, I might not like the answers. So I kept going. Same routine, same structure, same life, and from the outside, nothing changed. But inside, that feeling didn't go away. It got quieter at times, louder at others, but it was always there, like something trying to get my attention, without forcing it. Not yet. I started noticing it more in small moments. Driving home after a long day, sitting in silence, looking around my own house and feeling like I was just passing through, like I lived there, but wasn't really there. And that's a strange feeling, to be in your own life and feel like a guest. I didn't understand it, so I tried to fix it the only way I knew how. I worked more, stayed busy, filled my time. Because when you're busy, you don't have time to think, and thinking, that's where the problem was. At least, that's what I told myself. So, I doubled down. More work, more structure, more control. And for a while, it worked. That feeling faded into the background again. Not gone, just quieter, until it wasn't. There was a moment. Not dramatic. Not something you'd expect. It didn't happen during a crisis or a big life event. It happened on a normal day. That's what made it hit harder. Because there was no reason for it. No clear trigger. I was standing in front of the mirror, getting ready. Same as any other morning. Same routine. same movements, and for a second, I stopped, just paused, looked at myself. Really looked, and something didn't connect. I recognized the face, obviously, but it didn't feel like me. Not fully, like I was looking at a version of myself I had built, but not one I actually knew anymore. And that moment, it stayed. It didn't pass like those other thoughts. It sat there, heavy, uncomfortable, honest, and for the first time, I didn't push it away because I couldn't. It was too clear, too real. And the thought that came next, that's the one that changed everything. How long have I felt like this? Not, why do I feel like this? But how long? Because deep down, I knew this wasn't new. This wasn't something that just appeared. This had been building quietly over time, and I had ignored it over and over again because everything on the outside looked right, and I thought that was enough, but it wasn't, because a life that looks right isn't the same as a life that feels right, and I had been living in that gap for longer than I realized. That moment in the mirror, it broke something, not in a destructive way, in a revealing way. It showed me something I couldn't unsee. I had built a life based on what made sense, but not necessarily on what felt true. And now, I was face to face with that reality. No distractions, no noise, no way to ignore it. Just me, and the truth I had been avoiding, and that truth was simple. I didn't recognize myself anymore, not because I had changed suddenly, but because I had slowly become someone I never stopped to question. And now, I had to, because once you see that, you don't get to go back to not seeing it, and that's where everything started to shift. Not overnight, not in a clean, organized way, but in a real one. The kind that forces you to slow down, to look deeper, to ask questions you've been avoiding. And the first one was the hardest. If this isn't me, then who am I? And I didn't have an answer. Not yet, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't keep living a life that only looked right, while feeling completely disconnected from it. Something had to change. And this time, I wasn't going to ignore it. That question stayed with me longer than I expected. If this isn't me, then who am I? At first, I thought I could answer it quickly. Sit down, think it through, figure it out like any other problem. That's how I handled most things in life. You break it down, you analyze, you find a solution. But this wasn't that kind of problem, because the more I tried to define who I was, the more I realized I didn't really know anymore. Not in a real way. Knew what I did. I knew my routine, my responsibilities, what people expected from me, what I had built, but none of that answered the question. It just described the life I was living, not who I actually was inside it. And that gap, it started to feel bigger, more noticeable, more uncomfortable. Because once you start questioning your own identity, everything feels different, even the smallest things. I remember sitting in my living room one evening. Same place. I'd sat 100 times before. Same couch, same TV, same quiet, but it didn't feel the same. It felt distant, like I was looking at my life from the outside, observing it instead of living it, and that's when I realized something. I hadn't built this life intentionally, completely. I had built it based on what made sense, what was practical, what was safe, what was expected, and there's nothing wrong with that. But when you only follow what makes sense, you can lose connection with what actually feels right. And that's what had happened to me. I didn't wake up one day and choose a life that didn't fit me. I got there slowly, decision by decision. Each one logical, each one reasonable, each one easy to justify. Until one day, I looked around and realized I didn't feel connected to any of it. Not fully. That realization, it didn't push me into action right away. If anything, it made me hesitate. Because recognizing the problem is one thing. Doing something about it, that's something else entirely. And honestly, I was scared. Not of failure, not of making a mistake, but of disrupting everything I had built. Because even if it didn't feel right, it was stable, predictable, controlled, and letting go of that, or even changing it, felt like stepping into something unknown, and I wasn't used to that. I had built my life around certainty, around knowing what comes next, around minimizing risk. So the idea of questioning everything, it felt like pulling the foundation out from under myself, and I didn't know if I was ready for that. So, for a while, I stayed where I was, same routine, same structure, same life. But now, I was aware, and awareness changes everything. Because even if nothing on the outside changes, you feel it differently every action, every decision, every moment that doesn't feel aligned, and I started noticing those moments more. At work, in conversations, in the way I moved. Through my day, there were times where I felt completely disconnected, like I was just going through motions I had repeated so many times that I didn't even question them anymore. And that's when it hit me. I wasn't just disconnected from my life, I was disconnected from myself, from what I actually felt, from what I actually wanted, from what actually mattered to me. And that's not something you fix overnight, 'cause it's not just about making changes. It's about understanding, reconnecting, learning to listen to something you've ignored for years. And that process, it's uncomfortable, because when you finally stop and listen, things come up, thoughts you've pushed aside, feelings you've avoided, truths you didn't want to face. For me, one of those truths was simple. I had been living a life that made other people comfortable, not necessarily unhappy, not forced, just shaped by expectations. What I thought I should do, what made sense to others, what kept everything stable. And in doing that, I slowly stopped asking myself what I actually wanted. Not what was logical, not what was expected, but what felt real. And that question, it didn't have an easy answer, because I hadn't asked it in a long time. So I started small. I didn't try to change everything, didn't make big decisions, didn't turn my life upside down. I just started paying attention to how I felt in different situations, different environments, different moments, and what I noticed was clear. There were things in my life that drained me. Not because they were hard, but because they didn't feel like me. And there were small moments where I felt something different, lightness, interest, a sense of presence I hadn't felt in a while. and those moments, they became important because they showed me something I had been missing, a sense of connection to myself. And once you feel that, even in small doses, you don't want to ignore it anymore. So I started leaning into it, not in a reckless way, not all at once, just little by little, making space for things that felt real, letting go of things that didn't, or at least questioning them. And that process, it wasn't clean, it wasn't easy. There were moments of doubt, moments where I questioned everything, wondered if I was overthinking, if I was about to make unnecessary changes, if I should just go back to how things were, because that was easier, but I couldn't, because I had already seen too much, felt too much, and ignoring it now would feel worse than facing it. So I kept going, slowly, carefully, honestly, not trying to reinvent my life overnight, just trying to understand it and understand myself inside it. Because for the first time, that's what mattered, not how things looked, but how they felt. And that shift, it changed everything, even before anything on the outside actually changed. Because now, I wasn't just living my life, I was finally starting to question it. And that's where real change begins. Questioning. My life didn't break it. That's something I wish I had understood earlier. Because for the longest time, I thought if I pulled on that thread, everything would fall apart. That I'd lose the stability I worked so hard to build. That I'd end up lost, starting over with nothing solid to stand on. But that's not what happened. What actually happened was quieter, more internal, less dramatic, and more real. I didn't wake up one day and change everything. I didn't quit my job overnight, didn't walk away from my life in one big decision. That's not how it works. At least, it wasn't for me. What changed first was how I showed up inside my own life. I stopped moving on autopilot. That was the biggest shift. Before, everything was routine. Wake up, work, handle things, repeat. No questions, no pauses, just movement. Now, there were pauses, small ones, but intentional. Moments where I stopped and asked myself, why am I doing this? Does this actually matter to me? Or am I just continuing because it's what I've always done? Those questions didn't always give me answers right away, but they gave me awareness, and awareness started to guide my decisions. Little by little, I began making small changes. Not the kind that people notice immediately, but the kind you feel. I changed how I spent my time, what I said yes to, what I allowed into my space, and more importantly, what I didn't. That was new for me. Saying no, not because I couldn't do something, but because it didn't feel right, because it didn't align. And at first, that felt uncomfortable, like I was going against the version of myself I had built for years. The reliable one, the steady one, the one who keeps everything running. But I realized something important. Being reliable doesn't mean abandoning yourself. Being steady doesn't mean staying stuck and keeping everything running. Doesn't mean it's running in the right direction. That realization, it gave me permission to adjust, to rethink, to change things that didn't feel right anymore, even if they looked perfect on the outside, because I finally understood something clearly. A life that looks perfect can still feel empty, and if it feels empty, something needs to shift, so I kept going. Not fast, not recklessly, but honestly. There were moments where I had to face things I had been avoiding for a long time. Conversations I delayed, decisions I postponed, truths I didn't want to admit. And none of that was easy. Because facing truth, it doesn't always come with clarity, right? Away. Sometimes it comes with discomfort, uncertainty, even doubt. There were days where I questioned everything, wondered if I was making things more complicated than they needed to be, if I should just go back to how things were, because that was easier, predictable, safe. But every time I thought about going back, I remembered that moment in the mirror, that feeling of not recognizing myself, and that was enough to keep me moving forward, because I knew one thing for sure: I couldn't go back to that, to living a life that didn't feel like mine, no matter how perfect it looked. So I kept choosing differently in small ways, every day, and over time. Those small choices started to add up. My life didn't change overnight, but my experience of it did. I felt more present, more connected, more real, like I was actually inside my own life again, not just moving through it, and that changed everything. Because now, the things I kept in my life, they meant something, not because they made sense, but because they felt right. And the things that didn't, I started letting them go, or reshaping them, until they did. My relationships became more honest, not always easier, but more real, because I wasn't pretending anymore. I wasn't saying things just to keep everything smooth. I was being honest about how I felt, and that created a different kind of connection that didn't rely on appearances, but on truth, and with myself. That connection grew stronger too, because I was finally listening, not ignoring, not pushing things down, actually paying attention and responding. That's something I never did before. I used to think strength was about control, about holding everything together, about never letting things slip, but now I see it differently. Real strength is being honest with yourself, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it challenges everything you've built, even when it forces you to change. Because without that honesty, you can build a life that looks perfect and still feel completely disconnected from it. That's what happened to me. And I stayed there longer than I should have. Not because I didn't know, but because I didn't want to face it. But once I did, everything started to shift. Not perfectly, not instantly, but in a way that felt real. And now, when I look in the mirror, I recognize myself, not because everything in my life is perfect, but because it's mine. It reflects me. My choices, my truth, not just what makes sense. Not just what looks right, but what feels right. And if you're in that place right now, where everything looks fine, but something inside you feels off, don't ignore that. Don't push it down. Don't tell yourself it's nothing, because that feeling, it's not random. It's not weakness, it's awareness, and it's trying to show you something. You don't have to change everything overnight. You don't have to break your life apart. Just start by paying attention to yourself, to what feels real, to what doesn't, because that's where it starts. Not with big decisions, but with honest ones. And over time, those small honest choices, they bring you back to yourself, and that's the only place where life actually feels right. Thoughts you've pushed aside,